They say you shouldn't bring a tractor to a gunfight, but in 1942, that's exactly how the United States deleted an empire. This is the incredible true story of when America put tractor engines in tanks, and why the Japanese generals panicked the moment they saw them. While the totalitarian thugs in Tokyo were building delicate, over-engineered toys, the sleeping giant was in the heart of the Midwest, ripping engines out of farm equipment and bolting them into 30-ton steel monsters. These arrogant aggressors thought American industry was too slow to catch up. They were dead wrong. While the Axis butchers were scavenging for scrap metal, a secret mechanical mutation was happening in American factories that would turn a humble farm engine into a terrifying sledgehammer of war. But there was one specific engine, a forbidden industrial beast, that was so loud and so violent that it changed the rules of combat forever. What was the secret tractor tech that allowed American boys to crush an empire before the enemy even knew what hit them? In the war rooms of Tokyo, confidence ran high. Imperial planners gathered around maps of the Pacific, convinced that the American industrial machine was too sprawling, too slow, too fragile to keep pace with their lightning offensives. Their intelligence files, stamped with the red seal of the General Staff, calculated a window: 6 months. 6 months before America's supply lines would snap, before the factories of Detroit and Chicago could even begin to retool, before the US could hope to replace what was lost at Pearl Harbor, Bataan, or Wake Island. The logic was simple: strike fast, seize ground, and force Washington to the bargaining table before the so-called arsenal of democracy could find its footing. Japanese naval studies, circulated in the spring of 1942, described the United States as a nation with guaranteed limited reserve tonnage and a supply chain that would collapse within 6 months of sustained combat operations. Army memoranda echoed the same refrain. If the Philippines and New Guinea fell quickly, the Americans would never have time to mobilize. Even the legendary Admiral Yamamoto, though privately uneasy, was swept along by staff officers who believed that the United States would run out of fuel, ammunition, and the will to fight long before the leaves turned in New York. This 6-month prophecy shaped every Axis move in the opening campaigns. Carrier groups surged south. Armored columns rolled through Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. On paper, the numbers favored Japan. The United States had only 1,200 tank engines in reserve, nowhere close to the 30,000 needed for a global war. Axis planners saw American industry as a lumbering beast, powerful but slow to anger and even slower to act. They trusted that submarine wolf packs and jungle attrition would choke off the flow of steel and gasoline before any true counterpunch could be launched. But this was not the America of their intelligence reports. Beneath the surface, a different kind of war had already begun, a contest not just of armies and admirals, but of factories, foundries, and the raw will to reforge a nation's machinery overnight. The Japanese 6-month timetable was not just a miscalculation. It was the first fatal error, a blind spot that left them unprepared for the American sledgehammer about to be unleashed. June 7, 1940. The phone lines at War Department headquarters crackled with urgency as General George Marshall demanded an answer from Detroit. 7 minutes was all it took to set the alarm bells ringing. The Army's top brass knew what the Japanese did not. America's armored future was on a knife's edge, and the clock was ticking. In Washington, the Ordnance Committee gathered for a tense session. The minutes from July 15th, now yellowed in the archives, spell out the crisis in plain language. There were not enough engines, not by half, to power the tanks needed for even a single front, let alone 2. The R-975 radial, meant for aircraft, was already spoken for by the Air Corps. Every alternative was either untested, underpowered, or simply unavailable. The committee's emergency memo, circulated that same week, warned of a production shortfall so severe it threatened to stall the entire armored force before it could even move. General Marshall's demand was blunt: find a solution or risk ceding the initiative to the enemy. The ordnance officers, men like Colonel Clarence Cook and Major General Levi Mansfield, faced a grim calculation. The Army needed 1,000 medium tanks a year, but engine suppliers could barely promise a fraction of that. The minutes from July 15th record the moment in dry bureaucratic prose, but the reality was stark. Without an immediate pivot, the United States would enter the war with a hollowed-out armored core. The War Production Board, still in its infancy, scrambled to reassign priorities. A flurry of memos crossed desks from the Pentagon to the Detroit Arsenal, each one more urgent than the last. The Ordnance Department's internal survey, completed in late July, listed every engine on the continent that could be pressed into service. Tractor diesels, bus engines, even experimental multi-bank monstrosities, nothing was off the table. The administrative gears turned with a new ferocity. Contracts were drafted overnight. Civilian suppliers were summoned to Washington and told, in no uncertain terms, that the fate of the nation's armor rested on their assembly lines. By the end of that fevered summer, the industrial pivot was underway. The old boundaries between farm, factory, and battlefield began to blur. In the words of one ordnance officer, scribbled in the margin of a July report, "If it turns, burns, or rolls, we will make it fight." The American sledgehammer was not yet swinging, but the forge was heating up. The Axis powers had bet on American inertia. What they got was a nation on the verge of transforming its entire industrial soul for war. Steel doors slammed in Detroit and Dallas as the hunt for a tank engine boiled down to two unlikely champions, the Gibbison diesel and the Wright radial. Neither began life as a weapon of war. The Gibbison, with its roots in Texas oil fields, was a 9-cylinder, air-cooled diesel built for the grit and grind of farm tractors and crop dusters. The T1020 model packed 1,021 cubic inches, delivered 265 horsepower at 2,250 revolutions per minute, and weighed just 559 pounds dry. The torque curve was a diesel's signature, broad and flat, peaking near 570 pound-feet, ready to yank a 15-ton tank out of a mud pit or up a jungle slope. The direct injection system, patented in 1945, was rugged enough for bad fuel and field repairs, and 78% of its parts matched the original aircraft version. Mechanics could swap injectors or pistons with what they found in a barn or an airstrip hangar. For the M3 Stuart, the Gibbison was mounted sideways, with a gear-driven fan punching air through a shrouded duct, keeping the cylinders cool under the Pacific sun. Across the assembly tables, the Wright R975, adopted by Continental, was the other workhorse. Born as an aircraft engine, the R975 was a 9-cylinder, air-cooled gasoline radial, cranking out 350 horsepower at 2,200 revolutions per minute and tipping the scales at 650 pounds. Its design was pure aviation, lightweight, compact, and built for bursts of power. For tank duty, engineers bolted on a massive fan and reinforced the crankcase, turning a skyborne engine into a ground-pounding tractor monster. The R975's torque, about 620 pound-feet, gave the M3 Lee and early M4 Sherman their punch, while the air cooling system, fan-driven and shrouded, meant no radiators to puncture and no coolant to leak. The carburetor was set for battlefield gasoline, but field kits let crews convert to diesel when supplies ran thin. Both engines were more than just stopgaps. They were the mechanical backbone of a new American doctrine: build fast, build strong, build from what you have. The Gibbison's diesel efficiency meant longer range and less fire risk. The Wright Continental Radial brought sheer horsepower and the reliability of a proven aircraft design. Fan mounts, custom shrouds, and reduction gears were hammered out in weeks, not years. The result was a fleet of tanks powered by engines that could be serviced with wrenches meant for tractors or biplanes, engines that shrugged off mud, rain, and jungle rot. In the hands of American mechanics, these engines became characters in their own right, growling, clattering, and roaring their way through the Pacific. Proof that American improvisation could turn farm and flight into battlefield steel. The Axis bet on precision and scarcity, and America answered with rugged simplicity and an industrial sledgehammer. Orders from Washington hit the factories like a thunderclap. William Knudsen, once a Ford mechanic, now head of the War Production Board, didn't hesitate. He called for steel, blueprints, and men ready to work around the clock. The arsenal of democracy shifted from slogan to reality, its gears turning with a new urgency. Detroit's answer was the GMA-57 engine, a feat of improvisation, 5 Chrysler 6-cylinder blocks fused into one. This wasn't a designer's dream, but a mechanic's solution, built from the bones of farm tractors and sedans. Early trials were rough, overheating, vibration, a tangle of linkages. But by autumn 1942, 70% of the A-57 engines passed their first Ordnance Department inspection. That number, unthinkable before the war, set a new standard. Each engine stamped GM was a direct reply to doubts about American resolve. Ford's Rouge plant moved just as fast. The GAA-V8, born from a scrapped aircraft project, was reimagined for tanks in months. Its block, carved from a single casting, could take the pounding of war, mud, shellfire, bad fuel. 92% of the first GAA-V8 engines cleared acceptance, a figure that left competitors scrambling to keep up. Ford's lines, once filled with Model Ts, now pushed out tank engines and hulls at a speed that defied Axis calculations. The War Production Board's emergency contracts left no room for hesitation. Language drafted in 1942 handed Knudsen and his team sweeping power: seize machine tools, redirect steel, override civilian orders. The results were immediate. By the year's end, tank engine production had tripled. The GMA-57 moved from the drawing board to the battlefield in under a year. Ford's GAA-V8 rolled out by the hundreds each week. Ordnance acceptance logs, stamped in black ink, charted a relentless climb. This wasn't luck. It was the product of a culture built on interchangeable parts, constant testing, and the conviction that every obstacle could be solved with more hands and harder work. The Japanese had counted on delay. Instead, they faced an industrial avalanche. The arsenal of democracy was fully awake, and every accepted engine was a promise delivered to the front. On Guadalcanal, the difference between survival and disaster often came down to the men in grease-stained coveralls working in the choking heat behind the front line. The maintenance crews of the 1st Tank Battalion, drawn from farms and factories back home, faced a brutal arithmetic: keep the tanks running or risk the line breaking. In the field, a Gibbison diesel or Wright radial wasn't just a machine, it was a lifeline. Mechanics learned to break down an engine block in the mud, swap injectors or a cracked head with nothing but a toolbox and a crate of spares, and have the tank rolling again in under 4 hours. Battalion logs from November 1942 record average repair times for engine faults at just 4 hours, a figure that stunned even seasoned quartermasters accustomed to days-long delays. Availability rates tell the rest of the story. For the first 3 months of the campaign, 85% of the battalion's tanks were listed as operational at any given time. That number, pulled from daily readiness reports, stands in stark contrast to the Japanese, whose own logs reveal tanks sidelined for days by a single failed injector. Every convoy that landed at Lunga Point carried not just ammunition and rations, but engine crates, an average of 12 to 15 per shipment, ready for immediate swap-ins. Depot procedures, hammered out in stateside manuals, but rewritten in the jungle, relied on modular parts and interchangeable components. Mechanics could pull a Gibbison out of a Stuart, drop in a fresh block, and have the tank back in the line before dusk. The American Sledgehammer was not just forged in Detroit, it was rebuilt, piece by piece, in the red mud of Guadalcanal, where every hour shaved off a repair meant another tank in the fight. Intercepted Japanese naval messages, translated by the Office of Naval Intelligence after the Battle of Midway, carried a note of disbelief. One admiral wrote of the unending flow of replacement aircraft pouring into the Pacific, a phrase that landed with the weight of a verdict. Japanese commanders, who had wagered everything on a 6-month collapse of American logistics, now faced a reality that defied every calculation. The battle itself was brief. 4 Japanese carriers were lost to a single American carrier, and the aftermath revealed a deeper shock. While Japanese repair crews scoured battered flight decks for salvageable parts, American carriers were already being resupplied with fresh planes and engines shipped straight from the assembly lines of Cleveland and Buffalo. Those translated intercepts, preserved in wartime intelligence files, record Japanese staff officers struggling to explain why the Americans could replace entire squadrons in days. One translation reads, "The enemy's supply is without limit. Each loss is answered with a new machine." The contrast was absolute. Japanese pilots flew into battle knowing that every zero lost stripped another piece from the Empire's shrinking arsenal. American aircrews, by contrast, landed to find new Wildcats and Dauntlesses already waiting on the flight deck, their engines still warm from factory tests. Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was the moment the Japanese command saw the true face of the American industrial avalanche. The myth of the fragile, slow-moving arsenal was swept aside by a logistics chain that seemed to have no end. From intercepted cables to the desperate notes in Japanese war diaries, the realization spread. The enemy's factories were not just keeping pace, they were overwhelming the battlefield with a tide of iron and oil. The War Production Board's ledgers tell the story in numbers that defy belief. 300,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, and transports rolled off American lines between 1940 and 1945. 86,000 tanks, from the first M3 Lee to the last Sherman, thundered out of Detroit, pressed into crates, and shipped to every corner of the globe. 2 million trucks, including 2.5-ton G504s, the Deuce and a halves and every variant in between, poured down the highways and across the docks, engines still warm from the test stands. Each statistic lands like a hammer blow. 300,000 planes, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks. The scale was not measured in factories, but in continents. Axis generals, who once counted on American inertia, now faced a reality measured in steel and gasoline, a storm of machines, relentless and unending. In the final months of the war, the Axis powers could no longer hide from the truth written in their own diaries and cables. A battered Japanese war journal recovered on Okinawa confessed that the enemy's factories were a continent-wide furnace. Every day, more steel and engines rolled off the belts, and our own depots were emptying faster than we could resupply. It was clear that the United States would outproduce us in every category. The myth of American fragility had collapsed under the weight of a reality no general could ignore. Admiral Yamamoto, haunted by the industrial rhythm pulsing across the Pacific, told his staff that he feared the Japanese people would be driven to the point where they had no choice but to accept the terrible fate of being crushed by the overwhelming production capacity of the United States. In the end, the war was not just lost on the battlefield, but in the echo of forges and the thunder of assembly lines. This was a prophecy fulfilled and a warning written in steel. Factories once built for harvest thundered into war, forging an industrial avalanche no empire could withstand. Today, American muscle still shapes global power, where logistics, not just firepower, tips the balance. Every modern conflict is a test. Can any adversary outbuild the American sledgehammer, or will the lesson of iron and assembly lines echo on? The arsenal remains, waiting for the next challenge. Share your thoughts below. What would overwhelm the world's next war machine?